So welcome everyone. I am Veronica Roberts, the John and Jill Friedenreich Director here at the Cantor Arts Center, and I am so thrilled and honored to be in conversation with my sister, LJ Roberts. We've got two of us tonight. And before we begin, I wanted to just make a couple of announcements because there's going to be some other special programs on the horizon that I wanted to make sure you all know about. And one is a virtual event that will be held by Cantor curator Elisa Pitchermarn Alexander. It's a virtual event for East of the Pacific, this show upstairs that's part of our Asian American Art Initiative. It's a virtual event on Thursday, October 18th at 6 o'clock. I don't expect any of you to remember that date and time. It's all on our website, so you can find information there. But the event's going to be, the title of the event is Beyond the Camps, Art Experience and Executive Order 9066, and if you don't know what that executive order is, then you need to come and listen. It's going to feature a conversation between Elisa, Patrick Hayashi, who's a collector and donor to the Asian American Art Initiative. Sorry, I've said that a lot in the last month. And he has a spotlight in the exhibition. And the other conversation partner will be Masako Takahashi, who's an artist in the show, who's also featured on the amazing audio tour. So both of them were born in the Topaz, Utah incarceration camp. So join us then virtually in your pajamas at home. And then I also want to encourage everyone to join in person, pajamas optional, for Stephanie Siyuko's upcoming talk at the Anderson Collection. An amazing artist. If you haven't seen her show Next Door at the Anderson Collection, she will be in conversation with Kim Beal, who's an art historian here at Stanford, who specializes in the history of photography, and that will be Thursday, November 3rd at 6 p.m., again in person. Hard to keep track of things, whether they're in person, they're on Zoom, so hopefully that was clear. And before we begin, I also just want to extend a round of thank yous, first of all, for all of you for being here, but also for the small but mighty team that put this talk together. I want to thank Michael and Diane and Alyssa, and also my amazing colleague in the director's office, Tammy Fortin, who did a lot of the heavy lifting. I also want to thank our amazing collaborators, our fabulous partners at the Queer Resource Center, Ben Davidson, and faculty member Max Crandall. LJ was here with a group of students, more informal this afternoon, which was really special, and we're really grateful for our collaborators there who are co-sponsoring the event. And I also really wanted to thank Pamela and David Hornick, who are really the reason we have this show, not just here at the Cantor, but it was organized by a very special organization in New York, Pioneer Works. And Pamela and David, I think this is the work, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know where Pamela is. Where is Pamela? Right here. Is this the work that brought you to each other? Yes. Yes, I thought so, okay. So you'll see there are two dogs in this embroidery, and I think you two were brought together by the love of art and the work, and by the love of dogs, if I'm not mistaken. So, thank you. And that's the person in the embroidery in the front row. I love it, I love it. We promise not to make you come up here, but fantastic. And one of the dogs. And one of the dogs, yeah. Amazing. I can't believe I hadn't even noticed it yet. It's been a busy day. But I also wanted to just say, I've been thinking, your show is about community and loving community, and I was just thinking how beautiful it is that it's on view here. As many of you walked in, you saw the Ruth Asawa face masks, and I was just thinking about the ways that both of these works are really about community and celebrating community. If you haven't seen, hopefully you glanced at them, if you haven't seen them already, the 233 ceramic face masks. But there's something, and they're both really epic projects, because I know that the embroideries that we have on view you've been making for 10 years, as I understand it, maybe more? More now. More now. Yeah. And the Ruth Asawa masks were made over a 40-year period of the sort of folks, family members, people who went into her home, collaborators, co-conspirators, and so there's something really beautiful about having these conversations and energy in this museum. So But before we dive deep into that, I wanted to ask you what you were like as a student, and if you could share anything about yourself as a student.
As a student, I was kicked out of high school. We can start there.
Okay, let's start there.
You want to start there?
Yeah.
I grew up out 20 minutes outside Detroit, and my family has been in Detroit for a very long. My dad's side of the family has been in Detroit for a very long time, and so I basically got kicked out of middle school. Went to an all-girls Episcopal school, got kicked out of there, but. And then it's an even stranger tale. Actually, I ended up in a boarding school in Northern California, which is in the news right now, and that's a very long story. But as a student, I was an incredibly passionate learner, which is interesting to be kicked out of school so many times. Mm-hmm. And I could talk about this forever, so it's an interesting question to start with. And as someone who's now a professor, I teach at Parsons School of Design, and so, I walked to class the other day and it's like, it's really interesting to be this old and also have been kicked out of school and to now be a professor that has graduated so many students into the world. But I was a really passionate learner, and I loved history and English class, and I also took arts classes, but they weren't very available to me. Where I come from, it's like, I think the emphasis is on a lot of, I would say, you're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, or you're going to stay home if you're assigned female at birth and you're going to raise the kids. Well, someone else does that. And that was just never an option in I was almost a lawyer, but I love to build a case. But and I'm a child of a lawyer also.
So
my aunt is also a lawyer in Berkeley. So. But so yeah, I was like very passionate. I was very outspoken as a student, and that got me in a lot of trouble, particularly in high school. It's something I was very honest. I could not pass math to save my life, which is something that I still struggle with. I love thinking about pedagogy now in terms of alternative learning models, because the way that I can do math is through reading. And that's like a way that Waldorf schools often teach math. So, and then I got to college at the University of Vermont. I was an English major. I loved critical literary theory, poetry, and fiction. And I had a couple life-changing things happen to me while at UVM as an English major. This is my friend Jason, who I actually went to college with at UVM, and we were in the queer political group. And but I'll talk about that in a second. But one of the big things that happened was that I was introduced to the writing of Michelle Wallace. And through Michelle Wallace, I was introduced to Faith Ringgold. And a lot of artists, I think it goes the other way around sometimes. But reading Invisibility Blues was a really big deal for me. And I loved poetry. And then I finished my English degree, decided to add a studio art degree, and figured out that basically that through material, I could write in ways that I couldn't by just reading the writing on the page. I do write on the page also, but it was materially activating the writing. And then also at UVM, I got very passionate about queer and trans issues. We started a free HIV testing on campus. There was an event, Condoms and Cupcakes. We started a conference called Translating Identity that ran for something like 20 years. It was one of the only free trans conferences in the country. There was a lot that happened, and it was very on the ground activism. It didn't really happen in classrooms. And then I also lived in a radical environmental co-op called Slade Hall, where I lived with a bunch of Earth First activists who would chain themselves to staple shelves with new bike locks and climb up signs and drop banners, and I would tag along with them and take all the photos for the press releases. And all of that came together at UVM.
Amazing. And I know that you have I love what you said about writing beyond with materials. I think that's really interesting. It's something we can return to. But I also know that, we'll talk about that later, but I also know that you have a history with the Bay Area, and I'm someone who still has a hard time referring to CCAC as CCA. And I must admit, I wasn't here for this project, but I'm just going to put you a little bit on the spot to talk about one of the most amazing projects that I've ever seen, or not seen, I should say, one of the most amazing projects I've never seen. And can you talk about your history with, I'm just going to say CCAC?
Yeah, well, it was a continuation of illegally climbing buildings when I was in undergrad. I never thought I would show in galleries for museums. I just thought I would climb things my whole life. But it's really lovely to talk about this right now because I started CCA, I think in 2004, and I was 23. And they had just announced that they were dropping crafts off the name of the school. And the campus was really upset about this. People were wearing shirts that said CCAC, the C is silent. And it was a big deal. And I decided that for open studios, very precocious, as a 23-year-old, first year MFA student, I would sneak a ladder out at, 6 in the morning? Because Jason held the ladder, and and I would knit the word crafts over plexiglass letters and take E6000 glue. And if you've ever used E6000 glue, it does not come off of anything. And I found the tallest ladder I could find and went up and glued the letters onto the sign. And then we just kind of disappeared. And people lost their minds. It was great. And, I had closed my studio, that was it. And what I didn't know was that they were filming the promotional video for the school the next day. So they were very unhappy with me. Well, some people were very unhappy with me. And then I said, well, it's art school. It's like a gift to the school's collection. You can just stay there. And then the communications department started calling the grad office, and the grad office asked me to move it, and I went up there, and I think I had to break a lot of the letters off because E6000, I'm sure the bases are still on the sign. I was there the other day with TT Takamoto looking at it. And so now it's actually in the Oakland Museum of California. You're so amazingly lucky that Christina Linden is coming here because Christina is incredible to work with and made the decision to acquire the work for the Oakland Museum of California. So it's there with some documentation and an oral history.
Amazing, amazing. That's an incredible story. And you were a textile, what was your MFA focus there?
I think technically it's in fine arts, but
okay.
CCA has such a long history of textiles, and now they're just producing these superstars. It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was very interested in learning as much as I could about textiles, but I also did an MA in visual and critical studies there.
Okay.
And that piece was just as important for me.
Okay. And let's talk about, I think this is the first work that I knew about that you made, and I know it's a lot larger scale than the work that's in the show, but it seems like it's enormous, right?
Yes, it's enormous.
It's enormous, but talk a little bit about, because I think there is also, we are starting to see sort of certain currents that run through your work, and talk about the Queer Houses of Brooklyn, and also this is a really collaborative work, and I'm interested in that too, since you've already spoken about sort of a collaborative nature to this.
Yeah, it was incredibly collaborative. It was, well, I moved to New York after I finished grad school, and it was an interesting time to land there because I moved, and 4 months later the stock market crashed, and that was a bad time to finish school and a bad time to move, and I just didn't know anyone in New York. But I started meeting people, and there was this kind of scene happening of queer collective houses around Brooklyn that a lot of them had names, So there would be like Den of Sin or Glitter House, which is still around actually. I think it's been around for like 15 years now, maybe even longer. There's, you know, the Pansy Commons, you know, they always have these kind of names. And a friend of mine, Rosa Daniel Lane-Levitsky, who is a collaborator and a collaborator of many people in New York, drew this map that mapped all the queer houses for an event that was called Queer House Field Day in Prospect Park, where there were competitive sports and you won by failing at them. So it was pretty great, and it was all very grassroots, and it was just a time where I think a lot of people felt very inspired. It didn't happen through nonprofit, it didn't happen through any organization, it didn't happen through a museum. It was just people coming together and having meetings and having workshops at their houses. It was called Forum. So there would be like, you know, pickling workshop, and then there would be a mental health workshop, and there would be a dance party. I actually met my partner at one of the dance parties. And so I would see this map and I just fell in love with the map. I couldn't stop looking at it. And all of the names on the map and where they were, and Rosa had put the Dutch colonial names also on the map. And so there was a real recognition of you know, it being on land. So it is a piece about, you know, quote unquote community, but it's a lot about land occupation and gentrification, and there's, you know, definitely the AIDS crisis plays into this work a lot as a quilt. So yeah, I actually made it at a fellowship at VCU. I was very homesick. I found the program that I was participating in there as a fellowship extremely heteronormative, which was like a craft-centered program. And I really wanted this alternative kinship networks that were helping me feel kind of like a loving, strong person to be amplified. It also came about actually with the censorship of Hide and Seek as well, which was a show at the National Portrait Gallery. An artist named David Wojnarowicz had a video called Fire in My Belly censored, and it was like a very kind of top administrative censorship that most people didn't agree with, including a lot of the curators. But the way that it also came about was that I wrote all these letters to the Smithsonian, very angry letters about the censorship, and my students write angry letters. I marched in all the protests, and I got an email that said, you know, I opened the email and thought it was going to just be a form email saying, we've gotten your 10 letters, thanks.
Yeah.
And it was a portfolio request. And it was for a show called 40 Under 40 at the Renwick. And I'd never done this before, but before I sat down with the portfolio, I insisted on a call with them. And I said, you have to guarantee me that you won't censor me because I'm going to take up space if we do this. And I have explicit content in my work. And they agreed to that. And so this work was created for that show, but it didn't go right to that show. I made sure to show it in an artist-run space called Grizzly in Philadelphia, AIR Gallery in Brooklyn. Then it went to the Smithsonian. And it's up right now also at the Renwick at the Smithsonian if you're in DC until April.
So that's amazing.
Yeah.
A show that began with diatribes.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the work, and here are some details that are fantastic here.
And the if you keep going,
Yeah.
the buttons,
Yes.
these are buttons that each house has an illustration in the name, and those are free for the taking. So it's also in the vein of Felix Gonzalez Torres, and my work often has a takeaway where if my work is going to be in an institution, I want it to also exit the institution and circulate in the world. So the buttons are free and get replenished endlessly, and they're also produced by a woman-owned button company in Chicago called Busy Beaver Buttons. And Buzz Slutsky is an artist in Brooklyn, did the illustrations as well.
And Buzz is in the show, which is great, in the show upstairs.
Yes, and there's an embroidery. Buzz was actually the first embroidery that was in the show
Okay.
in their kitchen. Yeah, while we were working on this.
Yeah.
That's how far back it goes.
That's amazing.
So,
I'm glad you mentioned the buttons, and and one more, just to show different scale also, and history also with, I think you've talked about visual aids being really important.
yeah.
And if you wanted to talk about that briefly before we go on to the embroidery, but I think this is a really powerful one.
Yeah, I mean, visual aids, I got involved with visual aids and I feel like a lot of my trajectory has been very serendipitous. And I am not someone who naturally trusts the universe and I don't have like any woo, but I do think that there's like, I'm working on doing that more because there has been a lot of serendipity. But I went to go see a film called Untitled that 3 artists made. One is Jim Hodges, and then there's Kinky King and some, I'm forgetting the 3 different artists, but they were showing it as part of Day Without Art in December. And I went on a terrible date to go see that movie at the IFC, and there was this glossary that was outside of the theater. And I had been doing work about the ongoing AIDS crisis starting in college. I had written a children's book about HIV and the AIDS epidemic for a literacy politics class that I was taking. I was very interested in HIV and AIDS, and I picked up this packet and it was a glossary. It was like this thick. And I just realized I didn't know so much about the ongoing AIDS epidemic, and I also had knew from a very young age that it had impacted me. Part of, going back to your first question about school, a formative experience of mine was, I talked about this in Terry's class a little yesterday, but I went to see the AIDS quilt when I was 16. And it was the last time it was entirely laid out in Washington, D.C. And I was the only person on the field trip that was like, you could sign up and it was optional. And I went by myself to see the AIDS quilt at 16. And it had a profound impact on me, you know, understanding the epidemic, but then also seeing signs and symbols and ephemera like this that had so much queer and trans vocabulary and symbols and pictures. And I had never seen that before. Like growing up in a suburb in Detroit, that just did not exist. There was no vocabulary. And if you did say something like, if the word gay was uttered, you were told to not say it and to be quiet. So I didn't have any of that. So going to that quilt for the first time was very profound. And I bought a names project t-shirt and I would wear it by myself only in my dorm room at age 16. So right away, my queerness was tied up with this epidemic. And I was also getting sex ed in like 1993, which was terrifying for a person. Most of it didn't make sense to me. But then also it was like, you know, you hear what you hear about LGBT life was AIDS at that point.
Yeah.
So, so visual aids, I found this packet. I went to a holiday party at a friend's house. There was someone watching Canadian music videos in a bedroom. I am like a human jukebox. It's like one of my weird talents where I have all these random song lyrics from songs from the 70s. And this person on the bed, whose name was Ted Kerr, and I sang Canadian pop songs all night long together. And through doing that, I figured out that he had made the packet because he was working for visual aids. It was like 2 months later after I got this packet, December 1st. And within 3 weeks, we had organized an entire program for visual aids together. It was a 3-part program called Not Over, You, Me, Us, and AIDS. And throughout my time in New York City, it has been the place where I've made the most community. My community is very intergenerational. You know, some of the people I have my like deepest talks with and I've learned the most with are in their 70s. There's also very young people involved. It supports artists living with HIV, most of whom are long-term survivors and many of whom are in the embroideries. The work that they produce around HIV and AIDS, I think, is really dynamic and pointed and you know, has practices of what an actual like intersexual dialogue looks like. And you know, I kind of go in and out of it now since the pandemic. It's been a like harder space for me to access with the loss that I experienced during the pandemic. But it is like such a loving community, and then what they do for artists that have passed away in terms of preserving the work that so many people wanted to throw out is also, I feel like so much of that work is alive. And I was talking to some curators. I was talking actually, there's a Jimmy DeSana show going up to the Brooklyn Museum, and I was talking to the curator of that show and just saying like, I feel like a lot of those artists are still around. Like I feel like there's so many artists that feel part of that legacy, and that it was like, there was some question about like, as a queer person, do you feel like you reproduce in this like artistic way? And I said, yes. Like, I think that that's what happens, and that there's like a past that keeps reproducing itself, but then keeps pushing forward. And a lot of my work does that too, so, yeah.
Yeah. We'll move on to Carry You With Me. And you've already mentioned that you were an English major, and I think there's a way that the title of this project feels very multivalent and feels like, I'm curious if you could sort of help us unpack the title of the work a little bit.
We could unpack my backpack and actually like show you it, but
Yeah.
so I started carrying a tote bag with my embroideries everywhere and embroidery everywhere I went. So I'm literally carrying the embroidery all the time with me, in a tote bag with a baggie with my thread. The baggie always says Fresh, which is my nickname from Hadley. They send me my baggies in the mail, like just empty baggies. It's like a strange thing, but so I always have the embroidery with me. It actually is carried with me. It's here. The one I'm about to finish is here right now in my bag. So, you know, I think there's like a sentimental part of it, but there's also just like a logistical part of it, which is that I need to work all the time to be a functional human in the world. And so I have it constantly.
So your backpack is kind of your studio in a way.
Oh yeah.
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 Yeah. I can work anywhere. I don't need I love having a studio. I would love to have a giant warehouse studio.
Right.
I'm working towards that. But if I don't have a studio, I can work just as well.
You're making your own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anywhere and everywhere.
Anywhere and everywhere. And I also wanted to ask you a little bit about one of the things that I think you might be struck by, those of you who've seen the installation upstairs, you might be struck by their decision to the way that they're displayed, sort of front and verso, and I think that's one of the most striking and compelling parts of the presentation, and I'm still thinking about it, but I'm curious what led you to that decision, and how have you been learning from that decision as well?
Yeah, the verso is, you know, they're like these, you know, they're abstractions. So I think I never thought I would make portraits. It actually felt against everything I wanted to do with art, which is something I talk about in the book. I, as someone who's had a body that has been maybe not the most comfortable for myself and other people, or is constantly read, or you know, I wanted to make art that didn't have to do with my body at all. I just felt, I was like, this is what I want to escape from, is like all of these things that get put on bodies all the time. So making portraits was the last thing I ever thought I would do. But I feel like portraits are incredibly important, and pictures of queer people being represented are very important, because I had none of that growing up, just zero. So when I saw the work of someone like Catherine Opie for the first time, that was really revelatory for me. I was, oh my gosh, who is this and what are they doing? So, you know, I think in a sense the representational part is you know, it's in part kind of, you know, a way of honoring my friends and to spend time with devotion and care, making an image of them that they feel, where they feel proud and beautiful, and also to have queer representation exist in the world. And so many artists are doing so much great work around that right now. On the other hand, we know the figure is always limited. And we know that part of portraiture is that people are always left out. It becomes exclusive, and for me, that's always problematic. I think that it's inherently, you know, saying that I'm representing the queer community it's not. These are the people around me, but there's always something left out. There's always something that's not represented, and that's difficult. You know, the abstraction part, I think, moves away from the body, and it almost feels like the essence of some of my friends, like their energy. People are chaotic, and in that chaos is a lot of beauty and messiness and all of the parts of life. What interested me about showing the backs and the front is that abstraction and representation, figurative representation, there's no binary there. It's the same as board.
Yeah.
And so the figurative and the abstraction are actually interdependent on one another. One wouldn't exist without the other. And they're the same piece, and that breaks down a lot of the thinking around, oh, this is abstract or this is figurative, because they exist that way together. And then the other part of it for me is that I have like this complete obsession with being hyper visible and invisible at the same time, which is how I really feel in the world. It's a very difficult thing for me to navigate in terms of people's gaze, where clearly, like, I'm a very big gender nonconforming person that like takes up some space, and so there's a hyper visibility where I'm looked at, or, you know, I have a rough time in bathrooms. People often tell me that I'm in the wrong bathroom, and at the same time, I can become completely invisible, and I've always wanted more agency over that, and that line. And for me, I think there's some kind of agency that happens in the back of the embroidery, where it's like this self that is more reclaimed and shape-shifting and hard to pin down and fluid and always changing. And they do always change, like the threads
Move around, yeah.
So, so that decision was also, you know, and like we were saying before we were talking, that the Cantor exhibition upstairs is very different from the Pioneer Works in one sense, in that it actually has, when I walked in, I was really happy because my instinct was to look at the backs of the embroideries first. And actually Frederick Weston, this is an embroidery of him, he was a dear friend who passed away 2 years ago, always told me, like, you need to put the versos first, like put that recto in the back. And I was like, I don't know, Fred, like I don't know if people are gonna get that. And my partner also would tell that to me. And this summer was the first time they were ever installed like that at a show in New York. And there's something about it where I was like, oh, it's doing that up there. So,
Yeah, and there's something about it that feels very much connected to books and pages, and so I like what you said, you know, it feels, and I know that, I think they were more movable, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, they're able to move. One did break at Pioneer Works, so I understand the fear.
Yeah.
And I have a great framer who was like, let me just come do some surgery, and it was done within a day.
Yeah.
But you can turn them, and that was part of the Pioneer Works shows, that they have a hinge, so they're like a book.
Like a book. And I think that's what's interesting is connecting back to that idea you said about reading bodies and having bodies being read. Like, I think that whether or not we're consciously aware of that when we look at your presentation, there's something that hits us about that notion of reading bodies that is maybe communicated more by having the recto and the verso both there. And And I also just really appreciate you talking about devotion and care being part of the project, and I think that's really important. Wait, going the wrong direction, because here we go. I feel like I also have noticed, I feel like these are also a bit of fabulous time capsules I've noticed of tote bags and t-shirts. If you look at the tote bags and the t-shirts in LJ's work, there are some amazing text on them and behind them. Zoe Leonard's I Want a President, and also I think Kay Rosen.
Kay Rosen did the text on the tote bag.
And
it's a little feminist art capsule happening.
Yeah.
And then actually the curator of the Highline, I did not know this, is one of the curators, Melanie Kress, is actually my next door neighbor. So did this project, like it's a very small world, but I had no idea that she was the curator of the Highline until a year ago.
Oh, that's so funny.
So she was just my neighbor.
Really?
Yeah. And did put that project up on the Highline in New York. So
Yeah. Oh my God, what a small world. And if you can't read the Kay Rosen on the tote bag, it's fantastic. It says AIDS ongoing, going on. But I just want to read a couple of my favorites of other works. God is a Lesbian. One of my all-time favorites, Free Consultation, Gay Divorce. Stop Telling Women to Smile, you saw that already. And then You Care About HIV Criminalization, You Just Don't Know It Yet. There's a way in which I feel like there's almost this archivist, history being captured here in the same way as that Portrait of Death captures a history there that precedes this. And I think this is a really, this one, I think I was really taken by the text. Because you've got to keep in mind, of course, I know many of you have seen this work, that it's like this big.
Yeah.
So to put the Zoe Leonard, which I'm not going to try to read with my neck turned, but to put that, there's just so much care, I think, in this piece that's really amazing. And I also wanted to ask you about your, you've mentioned the word kinship quite a bit, and I feel like I'm hearing that word spoken in a way. It's existed for a very long time, but I feel the word kinship. I think there's even an exhibition opening at the National Portrait Gallery maybe this week or maybe it's next week, called Kinship. And I'm curious what draws you, especially as someone who loves language and text, what draws you to that work and how that is reflected in the work. What draws you to the word and how that is reflected in the work.
I mean, for me, a lot of it is, non-biological chosen family. But I'm actually reconsidering a lot of queer kinships as biological, like reconfigured. I'm having a moment of thinking about my biological family relationships as being very queer, which is a different thing for me. But yeah, I mean, these kind of like familial networks that often arise through queer communities where people are mentors or sometimes even parent roles or have these kind of familial relationships that are very different, and sometimes there's a blood relationship but sometimes not, and that has been a very important part of my life. And starting when I was 13 years old, I actually have a piece in the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum right now that is about my camp counselor from when I was 13 and sent to FAT camp, who basically mentored me at age 21, starting when I was 13. And we're still, we pick up, like, we've never been away from each other. Wow. And so that relationship was my first kind of queer family. I think I will absolutely say it saved my life as a 13-year-old. And so building those kind of networks where, I am relying on those people for mentorship or reciprocal care or, just all sorts of kind of roles has been a completely joyous and also necessary part of my life. I've always kind of identified as a gay bachelor. Like I felt like I moved to New York because there would be lots of other gay bachelors and I would be growing old with a bunch of gay bachelors. And I still feel that way. I've been partnered for 11 years and I feel like we both feel like gay bachelors in the world, or spinsters together, we call it. Yeah. But having those networks of being able to have care and reciprocate care, but also to support each other, or to also correct each other, or to teach each other, or to learn from each other. And visual aids has played a big part of that for me, and there's a lot to say about that and different ways to view the epidemic as well. But I think that history also plays a big part in the way that I've structured my life in terms of love and friendship and support.
And I think I just want to mention there's a really beautiful small show of Amalia Mesa Baines' work at SF MoMA right now, and the title she gave to the show is Madrina, I don't speak Spanish, apologies, hermanas, but she's talking about, she pairs herself with other female artists who are intergenerational group, who she considers godmothers and sisters and peers who have like not just inspired her but sustained her. And so I think this notion of sort of joyous but necessary, I see this sort of being reflected more and overtures to that in more visible ways that are really powerful. But I wanted to go back to the notion of care and materials for you, because I'm always drawn to artists where the materials that they use and even the tools and the instruments and the ways you're making things have a really, they're very rarely accidental or incidental. They are integral to sort of what your project is. And I'm just wondering, as you've spent more than 10 years working on these embroideries, if you could talk a little bit about materials and process and a bit, because I'm interested in that.
It's a lot about flexibility, and it's a lot about being resourceful, and it's a lot about a bit of a nomadic lifestyle. And growing up in Detroit, I grew up in cars and car culture, and I have a lot of, it's a really bad pun, a lot of drive to be on the road a lot. I love being on the road. I love road tripping. Sometimes I find it really difficult. I do most of my I have not been able to think in my studio for a long time, but if you put me in a car and I drive, I have my phone. There's so many texts to people that are like random ideas that are just, that's where I think also. So all of the tools that I use, the big works are made on children's toy knitting machines, which is something that I started at CCA. One is called the Cool Quarter. It's this big. It's for ages 8 and up. I have all these Barbie knitting machines. I have these sock making machines, and everything is portable. So there's a lot of being able to take the work. Textiles I'm a conservator's nightmare, I know that. But, I folded up all the textiles, they go on top of the car, and I work on them in the open desert. It's just, it's constantly being able to use a material that is resilient, that's flexible. The tools are very accessible. Most of the materials don't cost me a whole lot of money, though I do love hitting up the garment district in New York City. And I used to go to Britex, was that in San Francisco all the time when I love fabric stores. But for the most part, I think a lot of the materials and the methods I use are very reflective of how I move through the world as a queer and trans person. There's like a marginality of all of these things, and there's a mirroring that happens with that marginality, even within the way that textiles works within visual material culture. I really feel like I move through the world very much in sync with everything. There's not a whole lot of divide between my art and life. It just is always with me. There's never leaving everything at the studio and coming back to it daily. There is when I have a big project, but I'll work on the big project at home or I'll space in other places.
Right, so if you do get that giant warehouse studio, it's not because you're gonna spend all your time making work there. You'll still be making it everywhere you are.
Everywhere.
But you'll have a little more storage, basically.
Art storage. I actually got rid of both my art storages this spring because I moved into a studio who I share with a very good friend. And that has been really wonderful. But I also, with the big pieces, I really need to see them laid out together. And it's very difficult for me when I can't see them all. It's another 10-year project. My gallery came over and they were like, when's this gonna be ready? It's like 8 to 10 years.
Right, right.
Okay. We'll start thinking about where they might be able to go in 8 to 10 years, you know, like with this like, you know, kind of look of like, okay, this is gonna be, but I really like working on things for the long haul, and being able to do that all the time is very grounding for me. And it's also, the work is about my life and my friends and the ways they inspire me, and so I actually do carry them with me all the time, so.
Do you have to be quiet while you're making the work, or can you, like, are you able to make the work, I know you said on road trips, wherever you are, but like, do you need a little bit of a sense of, like?
I have made this work during karaoke, like, it was
Okay,
like,
okay,
it's
that
like-
answers my question.
It was Max today, was like, I remember you working on Reese Beach in a tent, and there's actually a picture of me that Hadley took of me working in the tent with a chihuahua, not that chihuahua, in my lap. You know, so I'm working on like rowdy queer beaches where there's like multiple outfit changes by people every day, and people like strutting back and forth, or I'm watching while I watch, or I'm sewing while I watch lectures, or, you know, it happens in all different kinds of spaces. I do it respectfully, like I don't want it to be distracting for anyone. But it really is just like a all the time kind of thing. I mean, if you took me, there's pictures of me in like the tent when I was in a tent in South Africa when I was on a residency, working in the desert, you know, with a lightning storm. It's just all the time. Obsessed.
Well, it's wonderful that you like working that way, because if you are a New York artist, it is very hard.
It's very hard.
So you've turned sort of, you know, I mean, the size of your show is larger than many studios or apartments. So, you know, that is I think a blessing. But, all right, well, I was gonna ask you, but you mentioned already we're gonna wrap up so that we have time for questions from all of you. I wanted you to see a few more images of works that hopefully you've seen upstairs. There's Ted, who you mentioned.
And Chris, who was shown before, Chris and Ted and another person named Nick Knotts, who's also an embroidery, we all made a film together called Inflamed: A Litany for Burning Condoms. So a lot of people are my artistic collaborators, and
And
we all work together. They work together without me.
And this is sort of the signature image we've been using for the show. And the verso. And but I wanted to ask you, and then this is the show you mentioned, the Aldrich. So I think most of the work that you mentioned having a work in the Aldrich, but I didn't want to show an image of it because I want people to experience it in person, ideally, if they ever get to see the show. But you know, we've talked a lot about embroidery and textiles, but you also work outside of that.
Yes.
And I wanted to make sure we acknowledge that
Yes.
as well. And so can you talk a little bit just about the materials in this work that you mentioned?
Yeah, I started working with light boxes for the piece that we kind of passed through for the Brooklyn Museum. One of the best, to me, one of the greatest honors and most generous acts that I've experienced with art is when a curator says, well, what do you want to do? And you give them this zany idea and they're like, great. And and I was like, I've never made light boxes before and I've never worked with film. And they were like, well, it sounds great, so why don't you just do it? And both the curatorial team at the Brooklyn Museum and Amy Smith-Stewart, who is at the Aldrich, are really into risk-taking. And I find it such an amazing, like, feminist way of supporting artists. But I started working with light boxes, which brought me to Light Bright Neon, which is fabricating. They're way more than fabricators. They're family now, and they're my collaborators. But they mostly do neon, and I started this kind of relationship with them, making this work, which is called Stormy at the Stonewall, that's now in the National Portrait Gallery, the collection of the National Portrait Gallery. And the light boxes, it's about poetry and it's about working with text. And this project uses articles from the New York Times cut up and collaged together to talk about power, narrative, and the life of Stormy DeLaurier, who was a mixed race butch from New Orleans, who was also a drag king in New York City and performed at the Apollo Theater and was a bouncer at the Cubbyhole and Henrietta Hudson and lived to be 93, but was very much invisibilized after she had died. And the work at the Aldrich is a continuation of work with Lightbox. It has a Lightbox in it. And then it has a 16mm film that Nick Nas, who's in the embroidery, one of the embroiderers we've been collaborating for a decade now, who's an Iranian experimental filmmaker. There's like a little TV implanted with the 16mm film of me trying to dig stones out of the grounds of the Aldrich, which was also very generous of Amy. And then stones from my camp counselor's yard, which made a stone wall. So it's got these stones dug out from sites in Ridgefield, which has stone walls all over it, as very, very colonial land takeover, from early colonization by Europeans of that area. So I wanted to acknowledge those stone walls, take the stones from the Aldrich, which sits on stone walls, the stone walls from this yard, and make a stone wall that is temporary. All those stones will be returned, but it's a lot about the care that this camp counselor showed me, and then the digging of the stones to make a wall, and a revolution being, stone wall, which was a big marker of things, but also an act that can happen. Revolutions can happen in small ways, and sometimes that's writing a 13-year-old letters every 6 weeks to make sure that they don't, go down a worse path that they're already on. So.
Amazing. All right, on that note, I wanted to open up, thank you, LJ.
Sure.
I want to open it up to any questions, and if we can't hear you, we will repeat the question.
We have a mic.
Oh, and we have a mic. Okay, great.
Thank you. I don't. Yep. Is that no?
Just speak into it. It's on.
Okay, it is on.
It's on.
Okay,
You sound
amazing.
great.
All right, we'll deal with that in a second. Thank you so much for talking to us about your work and your career. And I wanted to ask a question about your early career. Would you be able to say a little bit about this around the time that you were in school and the time that you were living in the Radical Co-op and how you materially supported yourself through the work that you did, and how, if at all, like any of the ways that you supported yourself financially showed up in the work that you did either at that time or later on in your career? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I went to an undergraduate public school, so my parents generously were like, we got this for you. And then school was like I don't have student loans like other people. My partner has 6 figures in student loans, and that makes a really big difference. I teach professional practices at Parsons, so I talk about this a lot. It makes a really big difference for an artist not to have student loans to deal with. And I was really lucky that I was able to get some scholarships for grad school, and my parents being like, if you go to public school, we'll throw down for it for undergrad. So that's what I did. The work, I did a lot of weird jobs. When I moved to New York, I worked in a soap factory. That was my first job in New York, which didn't last very long, but it was like this meticulous folding paper around soap. And I was like, okay, it was just like working with my hands. And I was like, okay, dexterity. I was a dog walker with Hadley, who trained me to be a dog walker. So that's obviously in the work. And I also teach. And I started teaching pretty soon after I got out of grad school. And the teaching I'm at a point right now where I'm only starting to I'll be really transparent. I'm only starting to make more money off of my art than I am teaching, like at 42. And that's been a huge shift in my life. And I'm lucky my partner, who has all the loans, actually has a really great job teaching at Brown. So we're very fortunate, but we actually, living in New York isn't feasible for me anymore. It's just there's plans in motion because I want the warehouse studio, and that's not just like not gonna happen there. But, you know, I think that in terms of like the work that happens, I mean, I want to say that like I teach because I do teach because I don't get paid very much because I love it. Like I teach because I love it, and that's been my job now for, you know, I've been at Parsons 6 years, and before that I taught at CCA and Virginia Commonwealth University. And I think that the way that I come to teaching is very much also the way that I come to my art, which is a lot of, because I was such a troubled kid and got kicked out of school so much, I see these students and I'm like, we are gonna do this. Like, you're gonna do it. And I think that that is also like very evident in how I approach the work, because I mean, I don't want to sound cheesy about it, but like art kind of saved my life a little bit. I mean, not even a little bit, like it is the lifeline, but it's also like the way that I connect. And so maybe it's like the teaching is the connection. And I hope that I get to keep teaching right now. We're negotiating a contract at my school at the moment, so it's a very tense environment. But I've never been asked a question like that before. I'm gonna have to like mull my head around it a lot. But you know, in school, I was definitely financially supported. And then, you know, it's been like a balance of a lot of different things since then.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
First, congratulations on making money off your art.
And it's like it's been a game changer to like not have to worry so much.
I bet. So my question is about the work, and Kira, you with me, if you sell from that body of work, and because you've talked about sort of the complexities around portraiture and the way that bodies can be read or misread or just stared at, if there's a different way that you approach selling that work from other works of yours.
That's a really good question. Yeah, it was actually, my life has radically changed since this show. I never thought I would join a gallery, and I joined a gallery when this show went up. And this is also like very transparent, and I don't normally talk so publicly about it, but I did talk about it the other day, and it was, so basically when the press release went out for this show, I was inundated with offers to buy the work. And I lost my mind. And I had a studio visit with the gallery, and it was a great studio visit, but I thought they weren't interested in me at all. It was like a first date.
Right.
They thought I wasn't interested in them. And I thought they weren't interested in me. And I like walked away, and I was like, it was such a great studio visit, but I know they don't want me. And, you know, I guess we're all still 15 somewhere. And I ended up making a call to the gallerist and said, can you help me? Because I couldn't keep them in storage. It's too much. I don't want to have that much art storage. It's really expensive. And I didn't want them to sit in a closet for the rest of my life, because you do deal with that sometimes. And, you know, my gallerist said, they said, you know, he's so nice, Stuart, said, well, let me think about it and let me talk to my partners about it. And then they offered representation 2 days later. And they said, we would have offered you a representation in November, you just didn't seem interested. So, but there was a lot, you know, the reason I reached out to him was the fear that they would go to places where they weren't taken care of, or where they would never be seen again, or they would fall into the hands of someone that sold them on the secondary market in a strange way. I don't think about money when I make art at all. Like, I make work because I love making work, and I'm addicted to making work, and it's the way I connect with people. There's like, I hate dealing with, like, now I'm glad I have them because they deal with that. But, it was sitting down and having a discussion with them, a very frank discussion, and saying like, there's people where I feel great about this going to, or institutions. There are certain ones I'm holding on to. There's an embroidery of Jose Esteban Munoz and Jean Vaccaro up in the gallery, and they were very, very, very close. It gives me the chills just talking about it. And when he passed away, my partner was also at NYU Performance Studies, and Jean was just devastated. I mean, he was her mentor, and I said, like, you have to have this. Like, I just need you to have it. So, there's a point where, is that a chunk of income? Yeah, but I don't care, because it couldn't go anywhere else. And the embroiderer of Frederick, I'm hanging on to that right now, because that's been a big thing in my life since the pandemic, is his absence. So yeah, I mean, with other work, it's the most important thing to me is that it's taken care of, hands down. It's a textile. I want it taken care of. And I also want it, like when that Queer House map goes out, I get emails from so many teenagers. It's like kind of bonkers. And it's always something that I actually didn't know about the Renwick show at all until right before it happened, even though it was planned in advance. It's part of their collection, so they don't have to tell me. And it actually was a little difficult. I had a difficult time with that because I have to prepare for the kind of influx of a lot of people contacting me about just their own stories. And it's hard, I can't respond to all of them because it's crazy, but yeah, I would say all of the work is so personal that I am particular, and I've worked closely with the gallery to make sure that that's an agreement that's held.
Great, there's a question up front.
Apologize if this is a naive question. I have no real background in art, but this is a very complicated work with a lot of different materials. And do you already have an idea when you put something like this together what type of materials you're going to draw on, or is there a lot of experimentation to come up with the materials?
I think that's a great question. I usually find one fabric that I get obsessed with, and I build around that one fabric. So in this case, I would go to a Hasidic-owned fabric store below Canal because they had really cheap fabrics. And I'm Jewish, but I would like always get there on Sabbath and they would be closed. I was like, why am I like not here this month? Because I'm totally not observant. But they had this patchwork leather fabric that I got really obsessed with. And then I started going to the garment district and found other fabrics. And then the way, like I got all these zippers from a place called Materials from the Arts. And that was just a gold mine. So and I carry, I mean, not to use the title again, I carry materials around for years and years and years, even if I don't use them. And the way that I work on a piece is that I'll start what I can vision, and then different things will kind of pop out of the piece. And a part of the piece will tell me what another part of the piece needs. And if I can't figure it out, I'll work on another part of the piece, and usually it'll reveal itself. So, with this, like, I was like, zippers are like fenders, and then I couldn't figure out the headlights for a long time, and I was like, oh yeah, I gotta get light brights off eBay. And so I spent like a whole summer just buying light bright pegs off eBay, and then took them to Light Bright to get, they're half light brights in there. So this piece took 6 years to do, and it's a very slow process. I have a piece that's almost done in my studio right now that I'm having a lot of trouble figuring out the kind of final details of it. And I'm trying not to rush myself. It's just like a matter of being patient, and I'll get my notions box out and try all sorts of different things. And shoelaces fit really well with it because it is another thing that you need to move sometimes. You put your shoes on, so it's also part of the movement. That felt really congruent conceptually. So.
Great question.
If I was to comment on the question, I feel very healing in this event, and thank you both, Veronica and you, very candid sharing your creative process. This is my first event since COVID.
Oh, wow.
Being former Cantor member. So your narration about the struggle of identity, I resonate much being Asian American, sharing Shinaway, and how you shift yourself, especially over COVID, in Chinese attacks.
Yeah.
And really, we have Asian American artists to that.
Absolutely.
I was quite surprised, come from a country with so much censorship, etc. In America, you go through so much censorship. I was, thinking of free country.
Right.
You know, I go through
Absolutely.
some other thing I used to go through being a poet, etc. So I was trying to ask, if you were not going through all those struggles and dropouts and changing schools, would your art be the same? Would you have the drive, as you say, the activism to push it forward?
I definitely, I struggled a lot. I was I really feel, I look at my life now and at 42, and I look back and I'm like, wow, that was really, really, some of the stuff was just, it's like unfathomable kind of stuff. And one thing that I know is that I'm not alone. Like, so many of my friends have had similar experiences. It just doesn't get talked about. And that being able to have networks and friendships and relationships like I do, where it can be talked about, I'm very much realizing, like, I can't believe we all have this in common and we haven't talked about it. And I think that that's something that happens so much in terms of marginality, where we're made to feel like we're alone in our struggles, when it's really more common than not to share those struggles. I also feel like, my experience of growing up as like a queer trans person, I think it's really lovely in terms of using the word healing, because for me, like, I watch how, obviously queer and trans kids are totally under attack right now, and it's horrific, but I do see examples within my community. I have a lot of friends that have kids who have queer and trans kids, and it's like a different ballgame.
Yeah.
And, there's part of me that's like, oh, I wish that was there, but I am who I am because of my experiences. I'm really happy I chose to be an adult. My 30s were awesome, which feels great to say after having like a really intense childhood, teenage 20s. I don't know. I think that it's just important to realize that so many of us are together in struggle. And like I also am just really psyched about the Asian American Initiative here, and everything that's happened with that community in terms of COVID, and also historically throughout the United States, and to so many different communities. It is, I hope that it's one of those things where institutions are doing it now and continue to keep doing it in right ways. Like, I'm glad they're doing it, and what I ask for is like momentum, that it keeps going and going and going and going too. So, and I'm really glad that you came out to the event tonight, so thank you.
Yeah, I really like that too. I got a lot out of it.
Thank you. You may not have been in the CCA promotional video, but I think we might use you for the cantors.
And I also I really want to thank Pamela and David Hornick too for their support of the show, and their friendship also. They're such fun people to be friends with, and like, you should see us just taking dog pictures all the time together. It's like become one of the most joyous things in my life, particularly over the past 2 years. So thank you so much, Pamela and David, also in New York. It's just been, it's like we share a very similar wavelength in life, so it's been really wonderful. And so many artists around me also who Pamela and David also have made a difference for. So.
Well, I think that is a generous note to end on, and I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you especially to LJ for being so generative and generous, and just a round of applause for LJ.